Let's talk about our trending topic, which is the Righteous Gemstones. It's an HBO series, and we're going to talk about the Righteous Gemstones as well as megachurch culture. If you don't know about the Righteous Gemstones, all of us, I would say we all love this show. Fantastic, funny, cringeworthy. It's Danny McBride's latest HBO creation. It's about a Southern megachurch with a very successful but dysfunctional family, the Gemstone family. And we're going to talk a little bit about them and then megachurches and televangelism and how they can vary, and also some of the messages that come from being involved in those communities, as well as some of the aspects of those communities that would be good to talk about psychologically. So let me just get your take on the show first of all. Let's just do kind of a round robin on your general review of the show, your take on the show, what you like about it or what you don't like about it. Start with Emma Kate.
So I will just go ahead and comment for our listeners who have not seen the show. The first episode is unreal. The opening scene and the ending scene, without spoiling anything, are fantastic. And I think one of the things that I've enjoyed so much about this is that I had a general sense of where it was going, obviously, but I've enjoyed seeing some of the characters develop, and it's so fun. And it is a riot, though.
Jonathan?
Well, I want to encourage listeners, if you haven't watched it, pause this recording and then go watch it, because it's really going to be a unsatisfying episode if we can't really talk about some of the aspects of the show. I will just say it's very funny. It is very sharp. It is vulgar. It is very playful.
Just a little.
But I also think that it's very humanistic, and I think that it is very charitable to all of its characters, that it really takes time to show conflict and flaws, but also human aspects. And I really appreciate that, because this show could really easily go for cheap punchlines. It really could. The subject matter is ripe for parody and satire, and it's there, but I don't think it's at the expense of people who really come from a place of deep spiritual or religious belief. And maybe that's a blind spot of mine. I don't know, but I tend to find that a lot of the punchlines are not at the expense of the congregants or some of the central messages. It's really more of the exaggerated dysfunction of the central family.
Yeah, if you notice the show, if you watch it, I don't think there's ever any involvement of people that are part of the church. You never see the characters are not the congregants. They're not the people who are part of this mega church. It's really about the family. And I agree with you that it pulls off something that's really hard to do, and that is you've got these very flawed characters, all of whom I think without exception are stupid and
Wow.
and shrewd. Like they're both kind of dumb, and they're cunning in some ways. And yet it does make you connect with them, like them. There's a humanity about them. The writing's sharp, but also the performances really help this. Some of the performances are just outstanding. I personally love Walton Goggins in anything he does. I mean, if for those of you who watch Justified, he was Boyd Crowder in Justified. I don't think there's been a favorite character, a better character of mine that I've loved more in the last 3 or 4 years of television than Uncle Baby Billy.
Baby Billy.
I just love with the hair and the teeth.
I wish I had his teeth, Uncle Baby Billy.
I mean, it's just, but would you guys agree that like I'm going through the characters and they're all kind of dumb and they're all very conniving and shrewd in their own way, but they're also all kind of like human and you feel for them in some way.
I guess I would agree that there are a lot of quote unquote dumb aspects to the characters, but I don't feel like I've seen a lot from John Goodman's character with that. So the dad, Dr. Eli Gemstone, who's the main pastor, I feel like we've gotten part of his storyline, and there's probably going to be more that'll come out from that. But as kind of the patriarch of that family, I feel like he's the one who has it the most together, which may or may not be saying a lot.
Yeah,
he's the least dumb of the characters.
I would disagree. I think he's not dumb. He's definitely an ineffective parent.
Oh,
But I think the matriarch, Amy Lee, shows that she is the smartest one, and her absence really is the root of a lot of the dysfunction coming to the forefront.
Mm-hmm.
So
Blue.
That's a good observation.
She's loving, and she tolerates a lot, but her absence really leads to a lot of misbehaving.
Ain't misbehaving.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, can we talk about an interview that you did?
Absolutely. I had the privilege, it was an absolute joy to talk to Joseph Stevens, the composer of the Righteous Gemstones and one of the collaborators of the song Misbehavin'. He lives here in Charlotte, North Carolina, and we talked a lot about, honestly, how that song really is the heart and soul of the show. It is childish, it's playful, it's spiritual, but the lyrics kind of foreshadow a lot of the challenges of the family. And it also really brings in this arc of regret and nostalgia and grief and loss, because you see through the Gemstone family and baby Billy Freeman how the absence of the matriarch, the absence of his sister, Amy Lee, really has led to the family just really falling apart interpersonally. She was the rock and anchor. And I would articulate that is actually true with a lot of religious families that I come across, that even though historically there's a lot of tradition of being a patriarchal, it's usually a very strong and sturdy mother figure that keeps the family together.
Yeah. And I think you've already said this. We would agree that the show exposes hypocrisy. It exposes the problems with power and greed. It is not necessarily a show that is anti-faith. It is just saying that this particular family has gotten caught up in this hypocritical lifestyle, and maybe for the reasons that Jonathan's talking about, they've lost their anchor. But let's transition a little bit and talk about this idea of the megachurch. And megachurches are usually, they're different definitions. They're usually churches that are 2,000 people or more, and they pop up all over the place in the United States. But it's not just a U.S. phenomenon. There are megachurches in South Korea. There are megachurches in Europe, not many, but in other Asian countries. So what is your take on the rise of the megachurch? Not just church, but the megachurch per se. What's that about?
I feel the megachurch, because when you think about churches in general, it is a place for a community. It's a place to get support. It's a place to lean in when times are hard and also to celebrate when things are good. And there's this layer of production that I feel like without modern technology, we couldn't have kind of achieved the heights where, even in the Gemstones, they've got like lasers and fog machines, which is just insane because most churches, to my knowledge, don't do that. But you can't help but feel that people enjoy the show, and it becomes less about the message sometimes with these larger churches. And I'm making generalized statements here, so maybe that's not fair, but I don't know. It just feels like it's more of a production, and then people are excited to be entertained while also getting scripture or whatever it is that they believe.
I think there's a lot of reasons or things that really inform that. I actually, I studied theology at an undergrad level. I went to seminary, and my first master's was in theological studies and leadership. I think part of it has to do with the in a lot of ways with church, it's no longer sort of this sacred retreat throughout the week, that it really is about engaging in culture rather than being separate. I think it also, at least from the megachurch standpoint, it really, there is a performative aspect that I think a lot of our European sensibilities of Christianity, at least white America, it's been more pious, more restraint. And in a lot of ways, if you think about the African American spiritual traditions, it was very outwardly expressive. It was very joyous and it was celebratory. And so we're sort of seeing white evangelicals try to kind of create and find their own balance and not be restricted to like hymnals and organ and a choir. But I think the other thing that's happened is our society is just so overwhelmed and overstressed and overtaxed that a megachurch is really about, videoing and broadcasting messages to where you can be in front of your computer, you can be at your home, you can have a relationship to a community without a personal connection or relationship with the minister or preacher. Like I actually go to a church that's probably considered a mega church here in Charlotte, and I know that they broadcast their services to a number of different satellite campuses and a number of different prison facilities. And so that's something that a small Methodist or a small Presbyterian church is not going to be able to do. So you've moved beyond the small community church model.
So I have a little more negative take on it, but not entirely negative. But I'm going to float this out here. So Jonathan, you know this pretty well. When pastors meet each other and talk about, is it fair to say that they commonly at some point talk about the size of their church and whether their church is growing or not in size? Is that a fair statement?
Are we using church as a euphemism for
I was just
something
wondering
else?
that. I really was. It's like a little bit of a measuring contest.
The rise of the religious right.
Oh my God.
No, I think that is very fair. I think that's a fair thing to say. I think ministers and people of faith are just as likely to look for metrics to quantify success.
Sure. I mean, but if they are truly business, right? I mean, yes, churches are doing certain things, but in reality, they are a business, even though they're tax exempt. But they are trying to, and I think the intention is really the key here. If you are trying to spread your faith with others, you would hope to see that you are reaching more and more people.
Is spread your faith a euphemism of something?
Yeah.
No, go on, Dave. I want to hear your critique.
Well, so I'm not saying this is the only time in church history where this has happened. I mean, we look at cathedrals and we look at giant churches historically in Europe, but there is a certain association with might means right and size equals success, and that is kind of that has become the cultural frame in a lot of among churches of like, your church is good and successful if it has a lot of people, and it is a failure if it has 200 people or 300 people, which there's no reason to think that would be true necessarily. I get that, but what that does then is it puts increasing sort of burden on the production and on the programming, right? It's like the production has to be stellar. The programming has to meet all these needs, and less about kind of the deeper issues sometimes. Now, I'm not saying always, but sometimes. The other piece...
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, react to that, and I have another part of that, too.
I think that is a fair critique, and that is probably true in a lot of instances. I do think that we all here on this podcast may be a little bit saturated. I don't even know if saturated is the right word, but when I was working in the seminary, I had a lot of research data, and Nashville and Charlotte at one time had the most churches per capita. We were number 1 and number 2, Charlotte and Nashville. It was like we were always competing. And so It is not uncommon in Nashville, it is not uncommon in Charlotte to find a 4-corner intersection that has 3 or 4 churches right there. And so I do think with an oversaturation of communities too, there might be a lot of like competition to really substantiate yourself and stand out amongst a overflooded community of worship.
Yeah.
Not growing up in the Pacific Northwest, that was not the case. I mean, the norm was people didn't go to church. So if you did, you were really making a statement about yourself. Here, it's like, well, going to church is like putting on your pants. You just do it every day.
Yeah, and I guess, we're essentially talking about quantity over quality of
In one respect.
Yes, in a certain regard. But even then, like, just to kind of counter, I think, we have these massive congregations for some of these larger churches, but yet they're still trying to foster smaller quality time focused on faith by doing things like small groups and getting people in smaller numbers together. So it's a both and. It's not, Yeah,
and I'm, again, not saying that all large churches are off base. I mean, I've been to large churches and what would be considered megachurch, been part of, but more of the way that then church health and life is defined is more about size and growth and those kinds of metrics, and that seems to be a biggie. But the deeper piece for me is that the megachurch promotes this even though they say often that they have more outreach and so on, and often they do, it ultimately promotes a more insular church where it's like you can have all your needs met here. You can have you can go to exercise class, you can go to you can have a food court and a mall and parenting classes, and everything is and it all sort of contained in this little bubble, which doesn't strike me as especially healthy or good. Other people might disagree.
Well, I think there are instances where it is good. So, like, maybe there's somebody that's in a very poor community that doesn't have access. They get bused to the church, and then they have an opportunity to eat a nice meal and go exercise, spend time with people, get support. And so, I mean, I'm not disagreeing, but again, I feel like I'm saying context like over and over and over again, because it really does matter where, however that church has defined their mission and their goals for whatever their outreach plan is, that's really going to be what shapes kind of their choices and decision making.
Well, I think by and large, the bigger a church becomes and the more that they do, the more they open themselves up for scrutiny of how much of that really aligns to the fundamental vision and mission of that community of faith. And some churches, both small and mega churches, they don't have a particularly pious mission or vision. It really is cultural, right? And it really is, church is a vulnerable place to attract emotionally needy people and people that will exploit other people in terms of positions of power. Like I've seen it, and it's just unfortunately true. You're going to get very charismatic, but very abusive and controlling and unhealthy people that are attracted to ministry because you have such sway and power over people.
I would say that one of the deeper psychological pieces of the megachurch is this, that I think historically people have been attracted to faith communities, churches in particular, because not only as an expression of worship and faith, but also as a way to connect and be known and build relationships. And I think that continues to be met by small and medium-sized churches, maybe even more so than a megachurch. But I think what the psychological need that megachurch is meeting is a sense of power in numbers, and we're right. And I think that's not been a healthy thing. It's a sense more of we have this sort of like base of numbers and power, and we're all kind of like-minded, and we don't have to be kind of stretched beyond that. And so I think in some ways that is not an especially healthy part of the megachurch culture. Would you all disagree or agree or see it entirely differently? I mean,
I see that piece of it. And I guess maybe this is just me being naive in a certain regard and hoping for the best. But, because most humans, so there's a classic theory, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where, the four bottom areas, you've got physical needs, you've got your safety, you've got your social needs, and you've got your ego. And then it's like once those four bottom needs are met, then you get to the top one, which is self-actualization. And so it's this idea where, essentially as humans, we all have this need to develop and this need to grow and this need to be creative. And so I feel like churches are fostering that. And the reality is it's like, okay, you're going to change and you're going to grow as a human however whatever it is that you will. And just because these places might feel insular, it doesn't mean that there can't be a paradox where maybe they find out some sort of information and it creates dissonance and they don't like it, and then they're forced to question their beliefs and question. And so it in a weird way, it could also do the thing that you say it doesn't do, I think.
Well, and I think culturally, the Christian community, American evangelical Christian community, let me be very specific about that. My experience in ministry, going to a Christian university, going to seminary, is culturally, they tend to be 10 to 20 years behind the larger culture. Like, they're reactive rather than proactive. They don't tend to be cultural setters. They respond to culture. I mean, even the Righteous Gemstones, the music, that it gives you that cue. You're listening to this music that's very familiar and that's popular, but we're talking about music that sounds like it would be on popular radio 50 years ago on AM. In a lot of ways, you look at the hairstyles, you look at all. I don't want to get too much into that, even though I love it. I love this show. I love everything that it's presenting. But what I would say is almost every generation, there is a remnant. There is a pocket of community within the American Christian church that reacts to things getting complacent or bloated or losing its mission. And so I think in some ways the modernization of church, and that kind of even led to the megachurch, was a generation that was reacting against this very cold, this very proper and emotionally devoid worship experience, so that they really tried to bring in all the different senses into their worship experience. And it makes sense that generation, what was the most celebratory and in some ways worshipful? It was like going to a concert. So that emulated. But now I think we are seeing a generation reacting to the detached and impersonal nature of megachurches. And you're starting to see in the last 5 or 10 years more community churches that don't even have their own building, that they're going into schools, middle schools, elementary schools, that they set up, that the majority of the staff are volunteers, and that they're really creating family-oriented churches where it's a group of families that band together for church within a middle school gymnasium, and then they tend to have other community activities within the community or at people's homes. So you're seeing this reaction. It's easy. Megachurch is the easiest target because it's so big and it's so visible to see. But I see all of these signs about these other churches that meet, but they're only at a place for one day a week, and then they don't have a building. They don't have a worship center.
There's definitely more to talk about, and I want to talk about this topic again, so we will pick it up later, but we do recommend Righteous Gemstones. You do have to have a fairly high tolerance for...
Or penis.
Yes.
There it is.
There it
you
is.
just said it. Yep.
Fairly high.
And by fairly, Dave, it really is high.
Or low.
High
or low.
Oh, boy. There it is.
Yeah.
Yep.
We're just trying to give you a tip before you watch the show.
Oh.
We just want to point you in the right direction. Okay? Check it out.
Fruit?
Check it out.
Yeah.
Check it out.
Check it out. Check it out. All right. That's going to do it for this edition of the Shrink Tank Podcast. For Emma Kate Wright and Jonathan Hedderly in Charlotte, I'm Dave Verhagen in Nashville. Please tell all your friends about us and make it a great week.